To facilitate the process and to make sure that humanity itself had backed up the captain's promise, they reached out across all of humanity and asked for some of the greatest minds to help them out to reconstitute the Zarnak back to their original form. The Zarnak were asked what they looked like, and they did have records of this on their ship. They looked at humanity and were surprised at how similar they were going to be. Actually, so much so that it was almost creepy. However, the Zarnak tended to have more delicate features. Even the males seemed to be more delicate looking than the human males. Many of the humans had already forsaken several of the parts that naturally came with them. During a few conversations, a few of them laughed at how humans could adjust their bodies so they did not have body hair. The Zarnak would always ask, "But then why did you keep hair on the top of your cranium?" The humans would always look at each other and laugh at this. Sometimes a giggle, sometimes a belly laugh, and it would all come down to aesthetics. The Zarnak was confused and eventually got the confirmation that humanity looked at hair growth as something that was considered healthy. A healthy set of hair was always something showing that they were a good mate, a good possibility to create offspring. The Zarnak understood this, but were a little put back as the fact that most of them didn't have any hair at all. If anything, only their females had a little bit of hair, a tuft of it, on the very, very back of their head. And it was very small, too. It was something that most of them, at least when they were still biological creatures, would remove, as it was considered to be cleaner to keep it either extremely short or to take it completely off via laser. The Zarnak also was surprised that they would have a similar, if not the same, amount of digits as a human. They were very surprised at this. Even more surprised when they were able to find out that there were two other species out there that were also sapient and sentient. They were surprised at this and wanted to meet them. And while things were being set up, as their planet was being terraformed and their people were being seeked out throughout the cosmos, several of the Zarnak made their way to each of these planets. They were absolutely amazed at what they saw. When they saw the wonderful cat folks, as some people called them, the meows, it was a whole bunch of slang being used. They simply looked down and the Zarnak were amazed. Those emissaries from the feline friends of humanity were not only put back, but in complete shock at what they seen. They had just begun to understand quantum entanglement, along with all the sciences attached to that. Genetic engineering was just on the edge of what they were working with, and they were astounded, simply sitting there listening to the Zarnak talk about their entire history, centuries upon centuries of sciences that were clearly beyond their understanding, at least for now. Many of them insisted that the Zarnak share, and they would simply look over at the human ambassador, and they were told, "That's your choice, not ours." The Zarnak had to discuss this with their own people before they would release all this technology, as if you release technology too fast to any group, it didn't matter if it was humanity suddenly given automatic firearms when they're used to using spears, bad things happen. The worst parts of their own cultures are going to come to pass, and it could bring an entire society to its knees and keep it there indefinitely. This was going to be something very questionable. However, this was less of a shock than what happened when they talked to the merfolk. The merfolk, seeing this strange glowing body with the head, simply dropped to their knees and started to pray to the Zarnak. They had to be told that the Zarnak were not gods, and the Zarnak did show this as they reached down and touched them. It was actual physical contact, and eventually they understood this, but it took time. They were far behind everyone else, as they were, again, barely into their medieval periods. They hadn't even touched a renaissance, as if they could, being an aquatic species. Although, with the fact that many humans were, well, dealing with the merfolk, it seemed that they were a bit more receptive. Though they also found that the elders, especially of their own species, those that were good men and women, were desperate for the technology to extend their lives. I mean, who wouldn't be? Yet again, this was up to the Zarnak. Humans had not shared this technology with them. The closest they had gotten was offering them a little bit of genetic engineering so that they could extend their lives, but it was an extension, not infinitude, as they realized that many species were just simply not ready for it. Although, eventually, on their way out, one of the younger merfolks screamed out a question that humanity was put on their heels as they couldn't answer. Because now this technology was in front of them, now this info was in front of them, and someone else was saying, "You're not ready?" Who was humanity to choose this? Every single human froze at this question because they had been on the other end of this at one point in their own history. They understood that you cannot stop this from happening. They simply discussed this with the Zarnak, and the Zarnak said that they would have to bring everyone together before they could make a decision, but what humanity chose would be on them. And humanity would eventually choose. But that has to wait till later. For the Zarnak were getting close to being reconstituted into their forms. They eventually were being brought in 1, 2, a half a dozen at a time, surprised to see each other after so long, some being separated for centuries, barely able to even be in contact with each other as their electric bodies, well, electric is not the right word, but basically the floating energies, when they touched, sparked and seemingly caused each other pain. This is when humanity realized why the Zarnak were the way they were. If you had gone that long without being able to touch anything, not a bulkhead, not a living person, nothing, you would go a little goofy too. Along with that would be the loss of their planet. Many of them spoke in strange riddles. It didn't make any sense to most folks unless you were listening close. Because of this, many psychologists came in to discuss things with the Zarnak as the last of the engineers were putting things together. With that, they began to understand that the Zarnak had spent so much time in isolation that it was simply tearing at them. Some of them might not be recoverable. Some of them might not be able to withstand being reconstituted. Many might just be too far gone. When it came down to their planet, it was a simple matter of finding out what their biosphere used to be like. Sending down several of their ships, it did not take long before you could see spots of green and an atmosphere being reborn on that planet. It made the Zarnak do something that no one expected. They smiled. A human gesture that they had picked up from working with the humans so much that it just surprised everyone. It even surprised merfolk ambassadors who were there. The catfolk ambassadors that were there. It was just strange to see this. The catfolk really didn't have the capacity to smile. Not the way people think they would. If they showed their teeth, it was a sign that they were getting ready to fight. But they wouldn't. They realized not only were they outpowered, but severely outgunned. And they really didn't want to piss anyone off. However, they did ask that if the Zarnak were going to be reconstituted, could they as well? Humanity wondered about this and discussed this for a long time as they pondered the implications of this. What would a semi-warlike species do with this new technology? Would they create weapons? Would they rip their own world apart? Would they simply create themselves to be bigger. It'd be nice to be able to talk to one of them without the incessant urge to reach down and pet one. Along with that, it would be nice to actually be able to talk one eye to eye without having them stand on a table while you sit down. But that would have to wait, because now everything was ready. Inside the massive ship, everything was reconstituted to allow the Zarnak to be reconstituted as fast as possible. However, the amount of energy needed for each of these, because they had completely screwed up the first time, would take the entire ship for each of them. As the first one walked in, the very first Zarnak that they had ever talked to had volunteered to be the first one to do this. He climbed into the pod, into the center of the room, and you could see that the entire ship began to dim as it began to pull energy towards them. Each of the scientists around stayed at their stations, only peering up slightly to look into the tube, but the problem was, inside the tube had to be shielded as it began to radiate unbelievable amounts of light. Inside, they could see their friend. It seemed to form into a shape, but it was too much. Even through the video, you could see something, but the video would constantly glare out. They couldn't get a good look. Eventually, they realized that they needed a soul burst of energy to push this beyond its limit, and eventually the entire ship ended up going through a brownout as all of a sudden everything flashed, and inside the chamber there was a burst and then a closing of light as it seemed to fade out. This flash was enough to make everyone turn away, but the flash also faded as the lights failed to kick back on. The energy burst had not only hit the main breakers, but it had pushed the backups beyond their capacity. And what could they do? They started to wait. They asked around if everybody was okay. Everybody was, but they still couldn't see. Most people in this day and age didn't carry flashlights, and eventually the emergency lights did kick on. They went over to the pod itself, and they could see something floating. Something humanoid, but unbelievably pale. The skin looked almost like skin that had never seen the light of anything before. Skin that looked fresh, like a child, like a freshly born baby, but it was stretched out normal, like a actual formed human. They could see again that there was no hair, and they didn't see any movement. With this, they all began to look at each other and began to freak out. Their equipment had not kicked back on. They didn't even know. And as they lowered the pod itself, they tilted it so that they could drain everything out of it. They opened it up, and they looked over, and one man reached out and checked to see if there was a pulse on the neck. "It's alive! It's alive!" he screamed as everyone began to cheer. And with that, they began the process of making sure he was hooked up to all the medical equipment they could to make sure he stayed alive, unfortunately still unconscious. They got him onto a gurney and immediately off to another medical bay so that those biologists can do what they do best. It was less than an hour later. He was up and awake, and everyone saw in the video as he sat up surprised and then looked around. He looked at his hands, and then he reached up and touched his face. One of the medical staff reached over, grabbed a mirror, and she handed it in front of him. And he looked, and he could see his own face for the first time. This pale, hairless, seemingly delicate man with piercing purple eyes looked back at him. He dropped his jaw again, seemingly a humanish gesture, as he looked around, and he just started crying wailing into the sky. Everybody thought he was in extreme distress until they realized he was crying in laughter. He was so happy to be himself. He went to jump up but realized that his body had just atrophied very, very badly, even though his muscles were there. And they were somewhat dense, as you could definitely tell there was muscle definition. It was like somebody who had just woken up from a month-long slumber. Just nothing worked right, at least for the first minute. Eventually, they got him on his feet, and it wasn't long before he was demanding that the others be brought in, and then he had to be told that they had to reset everything, as the amount of power needed was beyond what this one ship could handle. Along with others, the Archimedes Pride was one of the ones that was able to attach on to the side of the ship. Through simple connections of heavy cables, another 24 ships had connected to this one so that they could get enough power to start reconstituting the rest of the species. The rest of the Zarnak were elated, just cheering, and all fought to be the next one to be reconstituted, and were put a little dismayed at the idea that they had to wait until the humans could reset everything. It would have been a whole lot easier if they were down on the planet, but the planet itself was still being terraformed, and if they even tried to set up a base, it was most likely not going to survive very long. Plus, if something truly went bad and things got a little explosive, they didn't want to destroy an entire planet. The Zarnak were more than adamant that they needed to be reconstituted as fast as possible. The psychologists had their hands more than a little full, trying to make sure that the Zarnak themselves didn't simply charge in and dive into the pod itself, because the pod itself had to be replaced. And once everything was set up, then it was just one right after another. The whole process only took about maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and that included prep time and getting them out of the pod and resetting it. It was simple. And within just a few weeks of them beginning, humanity had saved an entire species from annihilation, or worse, death without dying. A life without being able to reach out and physically touch any others. And one of the truly wonderful things that they seen, which became the video that they would show if they ever met another species, to show their true intentions to being completely magnanimous in all things, was when one of the Zarnak females was reconstituted. She was on her bed, getting a little bit of physical therapy so she could get up and move. She didn't know who else was being reconstituted. And yet when one was brought in, she immediately tried to jump out of her bed. As many of the humans tried to hold her down, she screamed, let me see him, let me see him. And eventually he woke up and he screamed out for her. They started screaming in their language, something humans had not truly heard before. They had heard the Zarnak speak in common, which was, well, to humans was English. The translator was screaming in their ears, trying to change everything. Eventually, they were able to get them together within about a minute of him waking up, but they had to make sure that his limbs were operating. But they held him up and carried him over. They were able to lift her up as she very wobbly ran to him and grabbed each other in their arms. Apparently, these two had been married before. And for the first time in several centuries, they could hold each other again. Because they couldn't touch each other, they had separated. And now, for the first time, they did something again that surprised humans. They shared a kiss. He reached over and started to caress her back as his arms wrapped around her. She did the same to him. And everyone was sitting there just smiling. You could tell even through the masks that everyone was simply happy at this, at least until both of their legs gave out because they weren't able to stand for very long, which for most humans was funny. They simply put the two in beds next to each other, and you could see that they were more interested in being in the same bed than anything else. They had to be reminded that they're both in recovery, and if they tried to do anything extra physical, they might actually break their physical bodies. They needed time. And with that, the male actually turned and said, "Oh, time is something we have in abundance." The humans all responded with, "Yeah, me too," which was a running gag in human culture. With the Zarnak being reconstituted and their home planet being reborn, they were more than grateful to humanity for what they have done, and they would be another true ally. They would be the ones who actually were the key, the true key for humanity, as humanity had finally realized what they could do. They could, for the first time, reach out into the stars with such speed that they could not fully fathom it at first. All they had to do was change their bodies into energy beings like they had before, shoot themselves into the cosmos at speeds that a biological person could not ever possibly even think of dealing with. Even with some sort of buffer on the front of their ship to keep from the G-forces crushing them, they realized that this would enable them to reach out far beyond anything and discover new ideas, new species, new planets, new nebulas, new everything. Humanity fully understood this, and they celebrated with a party that lasted for the next 2 years. And while this party was going on, another change happened. Their first species to meet, our wonderful feline companions, had been gifted with the technology and shown how to use it. It took them a while to fully understand it, but during that 2-year celebration, they did learn how. And something truly interesting happened there. They would change themselves into energy, but when they reconstituted themselves, they would change the way they looked. They desired to be human, but there are limits. There are major limits on this adjustment, and when they did, it was clear that a few items still remained, and those items that remained on them made many a human smile. Not only from the fact that they wouldn't have to wait until their feline compatriot was able to stand up on something so they could talk to him face to face, but also for the fact that they were very nice to look at. It was actually surprising how well they had adjusted things, although there were obvious things that didn't, as in someone's appetite. However, they had to find out that a more human body has certain cravings, mainly for things like chocolate. However, that was of a different note when it came to their amphibious friends. The merfolk themselves didn't really care about looking more human. They enjoyed the bodies they had, and those that had stayed on their planet also enjoyed that, as they were again very pleasant to the eye, although some folks say, "Oh, they're nice, but they smell like fish." Others would laugh at this, thinking it was an inside joke, but no, newcomers would always say this. It was a common thing, because, let's face it, the human sense of smell was far greater than anything the merfolk had. The feline folks, they definitely would say that. However, there was not much intermixing between the two, as they didn't seem to like each other all that much, but they would work together, and eventually, as they both began to reach out to the stars, trade would happen. Surprisingly, something happened to the humans. As they began to reach out to the stars, humanity itself seemed to regress. Many species that they found, not only their feline folks, the merfolk, the Zarnak, and any others they found, they couldn't figure out why humanity was pulling back inside its own borders. Humanity would simply respond, "It is the cycles, the way of things. Only the Jarnak actually understood it, but the others would eventually. With that, humans would rarely step outside of their own sectors, their own planets. And when they did visit other planets, it was usually only one or two at a time. It wouldn't be huge swaths of people going on vacation. But every time they came in, there was always something that the humans would hear in the background. It's a human. Fuck yeah.